You can hear it before you see it, can't you? The rhythmic, bone-deep thud of iron meeting limestone, the sound of 1,000 men gasping for air that is more dust than oxygen, and the sharp, stinging crack of a Roman overseer's whip echoing against the white walls of the Judean wilderness. We like to think of the Bible times through the soft lens of Sunday school illustrations with clean robes and peaceful walks by the sea. But I've come here today to tell you that the world of 30 AD was a meat grinder for the soul. I've spent 60 years in the pulpit. I've seen the heavy hand of poverty break the strongest of men in the Mississippi Delta. And I've watched the enemy use the weight of the world to crush the spirit of my people. But nothing compares to the brutal, grinding survival struggle of the common laborer in the year our Lord walked the earth. The enemy is real, but my God is a consuming fire, and today I'm pulling back the curtain on the secret agony of the men who built the world that tried to crucify its creator. You are in a battle you didn't ask for, but you must win. And the first step to victory is realizing that the struggle for your survival started long before you were born. This isn't just history, son. This is a testament to the endurance of the human spirit under the boot of an empire that thought it was God. The year is 30 AD, and the air in Judea is thick with the scent of rebellion and wood smoke. We are standing in a land that is a pressure cooker of political greed and religious hypocrisy. To understand the brutality of this labor, you have to understand the geography of oppression. Jerusalem is a city under construction, a massive, gleaming monument to the ego of Herod the Great, a man who has been dead for decades, but whose shadow still chokes the life out of every peasant in the Galilee. The historians tell us that during this period, the population of Jerusalem would swell to over 200,000 people during the festivals, but the people who actually lived there were living on the razor's edge. Archaeological records from the excavations near the southern wall show us the sheer scale of the Herodian masonry. Stones weighing over 500 tons, moved by human muscle alone. This wasn't just a job, it was a death sentence carried out in slow motion. The tax burden under the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate and the puppet king Herod Antipas was so severe that a common laborer was often working just to pay the debt of being alive. The Romans demanded the tributum soli on the land and the tributum capitis on the person, and if you couldn't pay in coin, you paid in blood and sweat in the state-run quarries. If you weren't working for the temple, you were working for the Romans, and if you weren't working for the Romans, you were starving in the dust. I've studied these texts for 6 decades, and I'm telling you the political climate was a storm, and the working man was the lightning rod. Look at a man named Eleazar, a composite of the thousands who woke up while the moon was still hanging over the Mount of Olives. Eleazar is 40 years old, which in 30 AD makes him an old man. His back is a map of scars and knots, his fingers are permanently curled from clutching a chisel, and his eyes are clouded with the fine white dust of the quarries. Beside him stands his teenage son, whose hands are still soft, but whose spirit is already beginning to dim under the realization that this pit is his only inheritance. On the outside, Eleazar is a loyal son of Abraham, keeping the law and praying for the Messiah. But on the inside, there is a war raging that would make a general tremble. He wakes up every morning with a whisper in his ear from the father of lies, telling him that his labor is in vain, that his God has forgotten the smell of his sweat, and that the stones he carves will outlast his name and his family. The interior battle of the Judean laborer was the battle against despair. He felt the weight of the Roman boot on his neck and the weight of the religious law on his heart, and he wondered if the heavens were as hard as the limestone he broke every day. He was carrying a weight the world couldn't see, waiting for a promise that felt 1,000 years away, while his children cried for bread that was being taxed into the coffers of Caesar. He looked at his son and saw a future of dust, and that, my friends, is where the enemy strikes hardest, in the hope of a father for his child. To survive in this world, you had to understand the ritual of the grind. The laborers of Judea weren't just swinging hammers, they were navigating a complex web of cultural expectations and survival strategies. The heat in the Jordan Valley could reach over 110 degrees, and the men would wrap their heads in thick linen, not for fashion, but to keep their brains from cooking in their skulls. They followed the corvée system, a form of forced labor where the government could pull you off your own farm to build their roads or move their monuments. You would see them moving in synchronization, 100 men pulling a single sledge, their movements governed by the rhythmic chanting of a leader, a sound that carried the same bluesy weight of the work songs my grandfather sang in the fields of the South. They ate barley bread and onions washed down with sour wine that was more vinegar than fruit. Every gesture, from the way they gripped their tools to the way they shared their water, was a ritual of defiance against a system that wanted to turn them into nameless tools. They practiced the ritual of the first strike at dawn, a silent prayer offered before the noise of the iron drowned out the soul. When you walked through the streets of Jerusalem, you'd see the contrast, the Sadducees in their fine Egyptian linen, smelling of imported spices, walking past men whose skin was stained gray with stone dust and red with dried blood. The very smell of the city was a map of class warfare, the scent of burnt offerings from the temple mixing with the stench of unwashed labor in the lower city. The day begins when the first light hits the temple's gold-plated roof, reflecting a blinding glare down into the Tyropoion Valley. Matthew tells us that the harvest is plenteous, but the laborers are few, and you see that truth in the quarry pits. By 6 in the morning, the heat is already rising from the earth like a physical blow. The foreman, a man who sold his soul for a Roman paycheck, stands over the pit with a cedar rod. Every hour is a cycle of agony. You take the iron wedge, you find the natural fault in the rock, and you strike. If the stone shatters, you might not get paid for the day. If the stone holds, you spend the next 4 hours smoothing the face of a rock that will be buried in the foundation of a wall you aren't allowed to cross. Luke records that the laborer is worthy of his hire, but in 30 AD, the hire was often just enough to stay one step ahead of the debt collector. Around noon, the world goes silent for a moment as the sun stands directly overhead. This is when the enemy whispers the loudest. On one particular Tuesday, the heat was so fierce that a young man collapsed near the edge of the lift. The overseer didn't offer water, he offered the lash. I've seen it in the eyes of men in the bread lines, and I see it in the text, that moment when a man looks at his hands and realizes he is being consumed by his work. But then rumors start to fly through the quarry. They talk about a carpenter from Nazareth who is telling people that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. The men laugh, but it's a hollow sound. They want to believe, but their muscles are screaming that there is no such thing as an easy yoke in Judea. They hear that this Jesus healed a man with a withered hand, a hand probably ruined by this very work. And for a second, the hammers stop. The silence in the quarry is more powerful than the noise. Think about the sheer technical brutality of what they were doing. To move a stone for the Antonia fortress, they would have to cut deep grooves into the bedrock, drive in dry wooden wedges, and then pour water over them. They would wait in the suffocating silence, listening for the wood to expand, listening for the sound of the earth being forced apart by the pressure of the water. It was a slow, agonizing wait, much like the wait for justice in a world that had forgotten how to be kind. Once the stone split, the real work began. These men didn't have steel cranes. They had hemp ropes that would burn the skin off their palms and wooden rollers that would snap like toothpicks if the balance was off by an inch. I've seen archaeological evidence of crushing injuries in the skeletal remains of that era. Pelvic bones shattered, spines compressed, feet reduced to powder. They were building a city for a king they hadn't seen, while serving a Caesar they despised. Every stone was a potential tombstone. And in the middle of all this, the Roman guards would mock them, calling them donkeys in Greek, reminding them at every turn that in the eyes of the empire, a Jewish life was worth less than the stone it moved. This was a system designed to strip a man of his dignity before it stripped him of his life. The prophet Isaiah declared that the Lord would be a shadow from the heat, a strength to the poor, and a strength to the needy in his distress. When these men looked at the prophecies of old, they weren't looking for poetry. They were looking for a rescue mission. The book of Exodus was their heartbeat, the story of a God who heard the cry of the brickmakers in Egypt and came down to do something about it. They memorized the words of Psalm 127, knowing that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. They were living in the echo of the Egyptian bondage, seeing the Roman eagles as the new pharaohs. Every time they lifted a stone, they were asking the question Jeremiah posed. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? They reached back to the words of Micah, who spoke of a day when every man would sit under his own vine and fig tree, and no one would make them afraid. They were looking for the one who would fulfill the promise of Isaiah 58, the one who would loose the bands of wickedness and undo the heavy burdens. They didn't need a Pharisee to explain the intricacies of the law. They needed a deliverer who understood why their backs were breaking. They needed the one Zechariah pointed to, the king who would come lowly and riding on a donkey, not a war horse, because he knew the struggle of the common man. They didn't need a philosopher. They needed a deliverer who understood the weight of a crossbeam because he had carried one himself. You see, the theology of 30 A.D. wasn't found in the scrolls alone. It was found in the spiritual warfare of the workday. As a doctor of ministry, I've spent my life dissecting the principalities and powers that Paul writes about in the book of Ephesians. The enemy's strategy hasn't changed in 2,000 years. In Judea, the enemy used the spirit of heaviness to convince the population that they were nothing more than biological machines. This is a spiritual stronghold called deprivation. When you are physically exhausted, your spiritual defenses drop. The enemy waits for the moment your legs give out to attack your faith. He wanted those laborers to believe that the temple was God's house, but they weren't invited to the party. He wanted them to see God as a celestial taskmaster who was just as demanding as Caesar. But the Word of God tells us a different story. The blood of the Lamb was the only thing that could break the curse of the grind. Redemption isn't just a fancy word for being saved. It's a marketplace term that means someone paid the price to take you out of the slave block and put you in a family. The spiritual warfare of the Judean laborer was the daily choice to believe that their identity was anchored in the covenant of Abraham, not in the tax ledger of Rome. They had to fight for the Sabbath, not just as a religious rule, but as a spiritual act of rebellion against a world that said they had no right to rest. Let's talk about the white death of the quarries, silicosis. These men inhaled the fine dust of the limestone until their lungs were scarred and stiff. By the time they were 30, they were wheezing like men of 80. They were literally breathing in the project they were building. Does that sound familiar to you? Are you breathing in the stress of a career that is slowly suffocating your spirit? Are you inhaling the toxic expectations of a culture that demands you build a monument to yourself while your internal life is turning to stone? The laborers of Judea had no choice, but you do. They died so that Herod could have a palace. You are killing yourself so that you can have a bigger screen or a faster car. The spiritual anatomy of this struggle reveals that when we work for the wrong master, the work eventually consumes the worker. Leviticus 19 tells us that thou shalt not defraud thy neighbor, neither rob him. The wages of him that is hired shall not abide with thee all night until the morning. But Rome didn't care about Leviticus. Rome cared about the tribute. And today the spirit of mammon is still demanding that you work through the night, still demanding that you sacrifice your family on the altar of productivity. I want to stop right here and look you in the eye, spiritually speaking. I've been preaching for 60 years, and I know that most of you watching this aren't carving limestone in a Judean quarry. But you're laboring, aren't you? You're working 2 jobs to keep a roof over your head, or you're laboring under the weight of a broken heart, or you're struggling to survive a world that seems determined to tax your soul into bankruptcy. You are feeling that same heat, that same dust, and that same whisper from the enemy telling you that it doesn't matter. You're building a life, but does it feel like you're just moving stones for a master who doesn't know your name? You feel the pressure to perform, the pressure to provide, and the constant fear that one mistake will bring the whole structure crashing down on your head. You're exhausted, not just in your muscles, but in your very marrow. I want you to take a moment right now and think about the heaviest burden you are carrying today. Is it a debt? Is it a sin you can't shake? Is it a fear of the tomorrow? I want you to go down into the comments and tell me, what is the heavy stone you are asking the Lord to help you move today? Don't just think it, declare it. There is power in the confession of the struggle, and we're going to stand together against the spirit of heaviness that is trying to drown you. We are going to pray that the same God who moved the stone from the tomb will move the stone from your heart. The clock is ticking on your soul, and the hour is later than you think. We are living in a world that mirrors the tension of 30 AD. The signs are everywhere, from the rumors of wars to the hardening of hearts. The labor of the Judean peasant was a shadow of the final struggle we all face. The world system is becoming a global quarry, and the taskmasters are demanding more than we can give. The book of Revelation tells us of a time when the merchants of the earth will weep, because no man buyeth their merchandise any more, the gold, the silver, and the souls of men. Notice that, son. The souls of men are listed as merchandise. The enemy wants to buy your peace and sell your purpose. The event I'm describing to you today isn't just ancient history. It's a blueprint of the final hour. The doors of grace are still open, but the sun is setting on this dispensation. Just as the laborers of Jerusalem looked up from their pits and saw the clouds gathering over the Mediterranean, we are looking at the horizon of human history. The ultimate escape isn't a hidden path, it's a person. The carpenter of Nazareth didn't just come to give us a better work ethic. He came to finish the work that we could never complete. He saw the dust in Eleazar's eyes, and he saw the pain in your heart, and he said, "It is finished." The struggle for survival ends at the foot of the cross, where the greatest labor in the history of the universe was finished once and for all. I've sounded the alarm today because I love you too much to let you keep digging in a pit that has no ladder. You've seen the brutality of the past, and you've felt the weight of your own present. Now you have a choice. You can keep carrying that stone alone, or you can join the remnant that has heard the final call. The survival struggle of 30 AD was won not by the strength of arms, but by the surrender of the soul to the one who carries the world in his hands. If this message has stirred your spirit, if you felt the fire of the word moving in your heart, I need you to do two things. First, share this video with one person, just one, who you know is fighting a battle alone right now. They need to know that the general has been to the front lines and he's come back with a victory report. They need to know that their sweat and tears are seen by the Almighty. Second, subscribe to this channel and join this congregation of the airwaves. We aren't here for entertainment. We are here to arm ourselves for the days ahead. This is Reverend Isaiah Washington, and I'm telling you, the enemy is real, the battle is fierce, but the victory is already written in the blood. Don't let the sun go down on your struggle without reaching for the hand that was pierced for your peace. Until we meet again, keep your feet on the narrow path and your eyes on the eastern sky. The King is coming, and he's coming soon.